Hello and welcome to the Visible Women Podcast. I'm Kim DeBrew, and along with co-host Corinne Corbett, we put issues related to diversity, inclusion, and appearance in the spotlight and examine how they impact the lives of women of color. Today we're discussing visibility of Black women and women of color in political and social change leadership movements. This is a fitting time to cover this topic, as it will initially air at the beginning of February in Black History Month. I want to kick off the discussion by reflecting on a recent piece in the New York Times called Redefining Representation: The Women of the 116th Congress. In the introduction of the article, it cites that the very first woman elected to federal office was elected in 1917. So some 102 years later, there are 131 women serving in both chambers of Congress. And what was most striking for me was just the beauty of the images in the article. They represented a breadth of difference in terms of race and ethnicity, gender identity, and all the intersections of difference that there are. And I thought it was just a powerful statement and certainly a great way to kick off the conversation in February. Really the impact of voices of change, not just in political office, but at all levels of society.
I couldn't agree more about the power of the visuals. That Times article, the slideshow, I have a friend who works at the New York Times, and she put a GIF up of just the images moving, and it was beautiful. And it just made me really super excited about the future. But it's not just that there are women. For me, it is the way that the women are coming to work. You know, there have been women in both houses before, but they were oftentimes not trying to rock the boat, except for maybe Maxine. We've had some voices of dissent, but they seemed like outliers when they were. They seemed radical. But here we have a class, almost like an inaugural class of change makers who are not coming in saying, oh, let me sit in the corner and let's see how this thing works. They're hitting the ground running. They're getting on committees. They're using their voices from day one. And that signals to me that this is not old school. This is not what it used to be, like our parents' Congress, so to speak.
Yeah, I was thinking about the historical context too, and your point about change makers being sort of at the fringes is one I was wrestling with. And I feel like historically there are a set of women that were really understated, but were doing bold and radical things even for their time. So I thought about some of the sheroes like Mary Church Terrell, who almost at the turn of the century was pushing the suffrage movement to include more Black women. Ella Baker and her grassroots organizing during the Civil Rights Movement and her work with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and even Dolores Huerta, who was working with Cesar Chavez on the American Farm Workers Movement. So I think there are folks who have always been part of the conversation, whose voices were present, perhaps more understated, but certainly present. There's a quote that is attributed to Dolores Huerta that stuck with me. I wanted to amplify in our conversation today. It says, "Every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person, a potential activist. Every minute, a chance to change the world." And I think it holds, that kind of quote really holds great potential for the challenges certainly that are facing our country, facing our world right now. So with all that in mind, I'm pleased to welcome our guest for today. Roz Lee will be sharing her perspective as a leader in philanthropy, feminism, and social justice. Roz is the Vice President of Strategy and Programs at the Ms. Foundation for Women. And most importantly, she's an amazing mom, partner, and dear friend. Welcome to the show, Roz.
Thank you for having me, Kim and Corinne. It's great to be having this conversation with you today. And I really, if you don't mind me just kind of really piggybacking off of something that you said about history and looking at this through a historical lens in terms of the beautiful image of the changing face of Congress and seeing so many women of color. And I would say that it was that representation is a diverse set of women of color. You know, we saw a Native American woman elected to Congress, and we also saw across the country at the local and state level women taking office who are women of color who are not about business as usual. And that has always been true for women of color in terms of our political movements. The status quo, we always knew that the status quo wouldn't work for us. And so not only do we see these dynamic leaders elected into office, but behind them, running their campaigns, joining them as chiefs of staff, are also women of color. And so I think that that's the way that we have to think about our political power. You know, our marching shoes, our calls to action, our roles in elected office, our roles supporting leaders in elected offices, running community-based organizations, running social change organizations, working at the national and global level. And we have to think about the big picture, the broadness of how women of color are standing up in leadership. And not only stepping into the office, but bringing along the hopes, dreams, and promises made to people to stop doing business as usual.
Oh, that's so powerful, Roz, especially the part about bringing along the hopes, dreams, and promises, because often politicians get elected and get lost in the minutia of the work and forget the people that they're representing, or are intimidated by the people who they're working with. My question to you is, often these things go in waves and it becomes a quote unquote trend. Do you think this is a trend, or is this an actual sea change?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, how the leadership is being perceived is that this is a new wave, this is a new trend. I'm really emphasizing that we're seeing these kinds of sweeping into leadership positions and political leadership positions of women of color as the result of years and years of organizing. We have Black women in the South who are putting together 501c4 organizations, political PACs, very, very nuanced voter engagement strategies, and this is why women of color are being elected. This is why Black women are being elected. We saw in a state like Alabama record numbers of women petitioning to run for office. That is the result of organizing and recognizing that there are bread and butter issues that concern women, and women are the ones who are often representing their family interests. Women are the ones who typically are getting their whole families out to vote, right? Like I know I talked to many a woman in the context of my job and then in the context of my personal life, where people were going to vote together and they were families going to vote together. That is really the kind of work of women. And so I see that as, yes, we do see a wave of visibility for women of color leaders, but the actual back end work has been a constant and made it possible for these women to have success in this moment. That success will come with a cost and a backlash, and we're already seeing it. When I talk about not talking the same talk, not doing business as usual, we've seen the pushback already with Ocasio-Cortez. not following the rules. She didn't go to Congress to follow the rules, and we don't need her in Congress to follow the rules, because the rules do not serve women of color, do not benefit women of color. And when women of color are not benefiting, no one is benefiting. If we're talking about justice and equity and fair society. And so the patterns that we know aren't working for us are also ones that we can replace with solutions that we've been trumpeting for years. And my hope is that we will be standing strong with these women, not leaving them alone to do the work themselves, but backing them up, knowing that they will constantly be subject to attack.
So one thing that strikes me, this 24-hour news cycle, it seems to be such an interrupter of, I think, the opportunity to reflect and make meaning and sense of movements. And I'm curious about just your perspective on that. Like, anytime it came up for me when you mentioned Ocasio-Cortez, and every move she makes seems to be deeply scrutinized. And part of that certainly is because we can get information more frequently. And I think your point about, as the powers of the pushback against movement and change are always operating in parallel to any movement and change, right? They are progressing as well. I'm curious about any comment on how the news cycle may get in our way or may help us.
Well, I can say that I'm personally not a good for business for the 24-hour news cycle because I don't engage with it. It doesn't benefit me to keep the channel on, watching the talking heads. And in terms of the folks who are talking to issues and speaking my point of view, many of those folks, I know them personally. They're, we operate, we've moved in the circles. They're excellent advocates and leaders. But very early on, after Trump was elected, it became clear that I wasn't going to be getting any power or motivation from that 24-hour news cycle. And we all only have so much energy to give to making change and doing good. And that wasn't doing me any good. And so I tend to get my sources of information from direct contact with people, having conversations, putting myself in positions to hear a lot of different perspectives in real time, live time. I also read, prolifically and keep up on the media without, having to deal with the drama of, human contact in the media space. And so I would say that has served me well. I feel like I'm often able to ground myself in what I'm hearing from people around me. That's not rhetorical, that's not fancy talk. And so that's how I kind of understand what people really care about and how in my corners of the world I can help support that. From the places where I'm able to make a difference, I can help support that, and I can be a voice for communities who are often pushed to the margins. I talk to people all the time about the fact that I don't believe that people choose to be at the margin, that they're not moving themselves to the margins, but they're getting pushed there. And that is, I think, in terms of the social justice work that I've dedicated my life to, that's what I'm in it for. I occasionally have to find myself talking to media, so I've told you what my job is, and so I can't say that I never have to engage with the media. I'm saying that I'm not reliant on it to formulate my opinion about the change I hope for in this world and the difference I can make in doing it. I rely on those who I have closest contact with, and I put a lot of my energy, along with my partner Beverly, into creating even personal spaces in our lives in which people can have contact. Different kinds of people can have contact with each other, different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, gender identities, income levels that just creating those spaces and on a regular basis in our life deepens community in such a way that then it kind of echoes out into the world and we can see evidence of the change. And when you can see evidence of the change in your daily life, it motivates you, tell those stories, and those stories become true to other people, and it continues to echo out in broader ways. And at the age of 52, I would say that it seems, I've seen the evidence that it works.
You said so many great things there. I am particularly interested in your social justice work. And there are so many people who want to become involved in issues of social justice, and they don't know where to begin. They don't know how to engage. And there are people who have, I would say, have sat on the sidelines for a while and feel compelled to do something and don't know exactly what. So what are ways, large and small, to begin to make a difference?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the social problems that we're contending with they feel at times insurmountable. I was just reflecting on just the fact that, we have these really cold days this week in New York City. Many homeless people are just trying to find one warm spot just to get through the polar vortex wind chill that we're facing through tomorrow. And, my partner came home and she, swept in and she said, oh, I'm really worried about the homeless people that are out there. It's so cold tonight. I feel cold. And I said to her, I said, typically, I'm a native New Yorker. I'm like, the police, they leave people alone on days like this. Wherever they are, they don't rouse people, move them on or anything because they appreciate how cold it is. But even in saying that, I felt like it was not even in the realm of my imagination. And I talked about this on social media, that the solution could be that everyone had a home, a warm place indoors, because that has been pushed so far from our consciousness that we would hope for that the hope that I have is that they're not forced out into the street, into the cold, because they're, inconveniently located, And so what that means to me, Corinne, is that I don't want to lose sight of the big social change that we have to make, but I recognize that it has to happen step by step, and that we can't, but to not forget. So for me, that was my reminder. That was a personal reminder that my goal is not that homeless people are warm for one night, right? That my goal is to solve homelessness. But what am I doing? And I do things. I'm saying this as a person who I am doing things, but what can I do that keeps that larger goal in sight? And so I often tell, I get this question a lot from young people when I'm doing, teaching a class or talking to a group of young people. It's so overwhelming. There's so many things wrong, how we're treating immigrants, LGBT families, the fact that, people can't afford their health insurance or are concerned about losing it. So many things every day. What do I do? And so I typically do something every day. It's a big or small thing, and I feel fine about that. One day it could be signing a petition. Another day it could be making a donation. Another day I'm at a protest. Another day I'm starting a new a program in the context of my job. Every day I have a stack of bills that I keep in my pocket. I try to. My daughter Stella asked me for $2 the other day to buy a drink. And I told her that I really don't like giving away my single dollar bills because that's what I give people. And they ask me for money when I'm on the subway. And, and I'm just only giving those as examples. I'm not saying that people should follow my script, but my script is to not let a day go by that I am not doing something, actively doing something to try to make my contribution to advancing social change. And I do big and small things. And some of those projects are ongoing. Some of those activities are ongoing, but there are also those that are in the moment, singular activities. And then the last thing I would say is that we should trust ourselves around what we feel most passionate about. I want to be in the world the way that I imagine the world should be. I don't want to be so exhausted, so disheartened, so feeling a lack of sense of self and well-being that I can't contribute at all. And so I try to balance out the purpose, as a friend of mine talks about it, the purpose with the joy, right? And that is motivating for me to have a deep sense of purpose, to have evidence of it by making these daily contributions, and then to also, with the fullness of my mind, body, and spirit, seek out the joy.
What I take away from that in one way is that even if, we're not following your example, what we can follow is setting the intention always to be mindful of it.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is a place to start. You set the intention and then you start to do, and you can build upon that.
Absolutely, Corinne. And I have never felt more engaged and more active at this stage in my life. And I started out as an organizer when I was 17, organizing on my college campus to divest from South Africa. I've been a part of, really had the fortune to be a part of so many different campaigns, volunteering for Jesse Jackson when he ran for office. A variety of different kinds of social change efforts. And I'm proud of all of that. But I feel in the past couple of years of my life, I've had more room to help make change than at any other part of my life. I've had more belief in the power of people and our ability to make the impossible possible. I mean, I think of the example of how surprised people were when Roy Moore was defeated. And I think people said that was impossible. I mean, it's so many things we've seen happen just since 2016, just by the constant diligence of people who believed that it was possible, and they applied themselves to making sure that it happened. And so who am I to judge that something is not possible? So I'm on the bandwagon. I'm a different kind of leader than I was when I was 25 years old. When I was 25 years old, I was a part of crafting the campaigns and figuring out what is the bold new way we're going to take on something. 25 years later, I'm playing my position. How do I support movements and support up and coming leaders who have those ideas now? And I'm also leaving my ego at the door. And I think that that's one of the challenges around entrenched leadership. While we're seeing dynamic women of color leaders, we also are seeing some leaders who are the same old, and reluctant to step aside. And I would say that we don't have to step aside. We just have to let people step next to us and do that because we're doing it for what the reasons we say we want to do it, which is bigger than us as individuals, bigger than our own personal aspirations and kudos, but is for, as old-fashioned as it may sound, for the greater good. And, for the kind of racial and gender equity movement that we're seeking that will benefit us as constituencies versus profit us as individuals.
You took me back to college days with your comments. Very similar. We had shanty towns on our campus, and worked on Jesse's campaign and Kurt Schmoke, the first Black mayor of Baltimore at the time. And I thought about the notion of playing your position. And part of so I'm in the same bucket with you with age, part of our growing up visible presence was Black is Beautiful. It was big afros and dashikis, many of which we're seeing from an image standpoint coming back around. And I think some of those, that hope that we experienced as teenagers, as young adults, the notion of what was possible contributed to us being able to, let's say, 30 years later, being able to step into bigger spaces. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious about what you think about what you're seeing in the queue for young people. Like we've got daughters that are teens and tweens. You speak to probably college age students and students in 20-somethings. What are you noticing about their hopes and dreams with regard to social justice? Does it mirror ours? Is it something totally new that yet we have not seen what it shall be?
Well, I think we're, I think about it in a couple different ways. One is I'm very excited about what I'm already seeing coming from young people, and increasingly, when you see somebody like Naomi Wadler at the age of 11, speaking at a women's march with such power and sense of self. So that makes me hopeful, as a parent of a young Black girl, just watching her feel like, she belongs, right? That she should be heard, that she should be respected. That is, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And so, it gives me hope, because why wouldn't it? I mean, it's wonderful. And then I also, Kim, you know me well. We're fortunate to have the kind of family bond, and we have a lot of sense of, some shared aspects of the kind of families that we come from, and I am, I tell people now, like when people talk about change and whether or not change is possible, my life is a miracle. I'm a Black lesbian feminist, married to another Black lesbian feminist, raising a young Black feminist. I am the matriarch of my family, as my mother designated me, and the family accepted. I only knew family acceptance when I came out as a lesbian. My family continues to champion me and let me know every day, in all different ways and in public ways and private ways, how proud they are of me. And the example of my life is that I didn't have an image that this would be possible, that my life would be possible when I was growing up. I didn't know anyone who was like me, that anybody had anything good to say about, right? So I really feel like now my kid is bringing her friends over for sleepovers, and it's not a thing to them. Stella has two moms, right? Or that Stella is a part of an LGBT family, and that family is Black, and that family is activist, and and all of those things are true. And so I think like that is the example of our lives, is that I don't have to live my life behind the scenes of anything. And I think that is true for what we're seeing of women of color leadership in this country. When I think about the Black Lives Matters movement, that hashtag was created by 3 queer Black women, right? They did this. We're seeing movements, in the Black community, some of our most progressive action is being led by very diverse Black, young and age diverse, not only young, but age diverse constituents. And so we're seeing the evidence of it, and we're speaking it in a way that we didn't before. So as people could not talk about Bayard Rustin and the way that he organized King's campaigns. I mean, he was the organizer, right? And a brilliant organizer at that. And we continue to learn from the strategies that he brought to the civil rights movement. What is different today is that those leaders are not closeted, right? And they are not, in the way in which they are not closeted shows up in ways that I think unexpected ways and sometimes painful ways. So it makes someone like the actor Jussie Smollett, who was just the victim of a homophobic and racist attack, it makes it possible to attack him, right? Because he is known not only as somebody who is on television, but he's known as somebody who's an activist for LGBT rights and justice. And that makes him vulnerable. And that we're dealing with a dynamic where we, as even as a Black community, we have to deal with the nuance of what that means. That he's attacked for representing a part of our community as a Black community that it contains gay and transgender people. So he's attacked for that because that is who he is, and that's also who he is in the context of this television show. And that the people who victimized him are reliant on the fact that the community will not stand up for him because they believe the community doesn't accept him because of his sexual orientation. And so that nuance actually created an opportunity for there to be greater dialogue in our community. And sometimes that dialogue is painful and sometimes it's difficult and complicated, but I have no doubt that it moves us forward.
The evolution, I think that these conversations help us evolve no matter what generation we come from. There is no barrier to being able to change your mindset and to learn. You said something earlier about people not wanting to be in the margin. But what I'm realizing as we're having this discussion is change is being driven from the margins.
The margins, absolutely.
They are the author. Many times, the authors and the folks who are accelerating the changes that we are experiencing. So, could you talk about the importance of just recognizing that, marginalized communities have are the voices of this change?
Absolutely. I mean, you're so right, Corinne, around the change being driven from the margins. And in particular, I would really like to lift up Black women, and particularly poor Black women who are faced with surviving and helping their families survive. And yet their politics is about thriving, not surviving, right? They are not accepting that their fate should be, we should just survive. And if a few of our children have opportunities, we should be satisfied with that. And so a lot of even what we do at the Ms. Foundation is about centering those women and those girls of color, and especially Black women, but not only Black women and girls. But we think about the unique history of Black women and girls in this country and the combination of racism, sexism, and anti-Blackness. And so we're not leaving that part out of our analysis. And that's why I think, I have this emphasis, not only that because I'm a Black woman, but because I understand also the history of this country as it relates to anti-Black. And yet we have this pushing from the margins of these women who are saying, we are not settling, basically. We are not settling. And we understand the long game because we've been playing the long game for a really long time. And we are not just going to be this country's moral compass, right? We want tangible change that will improve the qualities of our lives and allow our families and communities to thrive. And so the social change movement is from the margins to the center. And that is what excites me about some of the organizing that's happening, some of the thought leadership that's happening about how you move from the margins to the center, but with context, with substance, and how you do that at every level, because it is important for people to see tangible change in their everyday lives. I mean, I am an out of the closet intellectual, right? So it took me years to get to that point because, I had to suffer the, being called a nerd all of my upbringing. And so I can definitely, if called upon, razzle and dazzle with all kinds of passages from this text and that text. But what really gets me going these days is really just being able to speak the language that I share with all other women of color, that doesn't have any footnotes, that is just what we know to be true and what we want to be true for our families and communities. And that for any of us to be individually successful is not ultimately going to serve our communities and families well enough. And that's how I am still connected in that way around thinking about where do I show up in this equation. And I only want to be with those who have been pushed to the margins, affecting the change to get us to the center. And the center for me as a Trekkie is where we all want to be, right? We all want to be. That's, to me, the nexus of justice and equity and fairness and love.
Your points about from margins to center, it lands for me in such a deeply personal way. I'm reflecting on conversations I've had with my white sisters about voting, about Black women saving us. And, where I've landed in the conversations is, look, we're doing our part, right? Like, been there, we've done what we can. I have one vote. So I'm curious about what you might say as an invitation to our allies, to the folks who will stand with us, as we continue to step into social justice movements, organizing in bigger and bolder ways. What's the invitation to allies for this work?
Kim, I have the fortune of, working with and talking with many white allies, women and men, in the work that I do. And so I know that they exist, and I know good work is being done. But what I tell people is this. I tell them two things. One is that I am not open to a conversation about what about white women, right? Because I just don't find that conversation useful, and it's going to take something away from me. It's exhausting, and I'm just not interested. And it's not a good question. But I also think that it is the responsibility, and I tell people, it's like, you're going to have to double and triple your own number, right? If there are people like you who are white, who are not wanting to cling to white supremacy or white nationalism or the legacy of white supremacy and white nationalism. If these folks are there, and I believe you, you're telling me that they are, and I believe you, then you have to bring them in. You have to make sure that they are standing with you. You have to have those conversations with them. It's not that I'm not an ally in the movement for racial justice and racial equity. But these are not people who are listening to or able to hear me. And so I feel oftentimes, and I've had this circumstance even in the context of my own family, that it is easier sometimes to talk to the other, the person that you don't know as well, the stranger, than having to have these conversations as close to home. And, and I'm speaking from experience about, having that personal challenge of having difficult conversations with my own family, as when they've made statements and done things that, I found to be problematic. And wanting to avoid controversy for let's eat the, turkey and the stuffing without, having a fight, or, XYZ. And it was just easier to kind of just let it go in the name of family peace. But if everybody is doing that, if we're all making that choice to avoid the difficult conversations, to confront how injustice and racism and prejudice and bias shows up in our own families, then we're not going to see the kind of mass change that we're hoping for. And the reality is that we have a responsibility to keep that wave going. Many of the problems, social problems that we're dealing with will not be solved in our lifetime, and possibly not even in our children's lifetime. But we do have an obligation to continue the march toward progress. And we are not going to be able to do that by avoiding those conversations. We are not doing enough for our families and children by not having those conversations. And so that's what I would say to allies, and that's what I would say to everyone that I know.
What lands for me is none of us, if we really are in and believe in the work of political and social justice, can avoid a difficult conversation. And we have to, I'm just going to keep on your set the intention of making a difference. Because if you don't set the intention, you're not ever going to do instead of saying one day I'm going to do it, if you're thinking about it every day, you'll do something at some point.
Absolutely. And I've really enjoyed that, Corinne. I'll say it's really kept me highly motivated to always have something to do. And I am, like I said, I feel like I'm at the top of my sense of hope and possibility, and the belief in the power of women of color. So, yeah.
Roz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim and Corinne, for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad you talked me into doing it. And it's I'm going to make sure I listen to as many of these podcasts as possible.
Yeah, this was an amazing conversation. It even had me thinking about ways that I engage and can change the way that I can. Has me thinking about ways to change how I engage in both political and social processes as well. So thanks again, Roz. We really, really appreciate you spending the time with us. That's our show for today. Look for the latest installment of the Visible Women podcast every other Wednesday, where we'll tackle issues and experiences that relate to appearance, diversity, and inclusion that are relevant to your lives. Check out our website, visiblewomenpodcast.com, where you can find out more about the episode and follow us on our social channels. Make sure you join our Facebook group to participate in discussions about our latest episode. Until then, here's to all the visible women out there. Never forget that we see you.